So before we get into our formal programming, I wanted to invite APIAHiP Director Gong up here to give a little bit of an introduction about the foundation as well as some of our project partners. So Ted, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you so much. So if anybody wants to come up here, you have some seats over here. You can spread yourself out a little bit. Don't feel shy. None of us are very shy, but I do want to thank you. Thank you all for coming today. And I want to thank the Chinese Community Church and the Chinatown Service Center for providing this space to allow us to share the work and findings that we in the 1882 Foundation and our partners have been working on for several months to a couple of years, right? That's not our fault totally. It's the pandemic, right? So anyway, almost 2 years considering delays, closures, difficulties caused by the pandemic. And that's how long we've been working on this. But we're now closing on and this to the final version of what we're doing. And I want to, we want to give you, as we have periodically and partially through community presentations such as Flashback and other talk story and festival events, we want to close to this closing point. And it's appropriate for us to share with you what we have and get your reactions, and very much want your reactions. We want your reactions and inputs for the final report. Many of you know it's the context study about the history of the Chinese and Korean Americans in DC. And many of the, but before we go any further, please I forget, I just want to single out, there's a lot of people involved in this program, but I do want to single out Mia and Grace and Sojin, where they are. Grace, so these guys have been so critical, and also Rebecca Miller here. She is part of the My name is Ted Gong. I'm the Executive Director of the 1882 Foundation. Our programs are educational, uncovering and preserving oral histories and story sites. You're doing it. Story sites. Working with educators on lesson plans, teacher workshops and curriculum, and developing learning resources. We build collaborations and best practices nationally and regionally through symposiums and conferences. We have a couple of conferences coming out. One that should be very exciting, Chinese American Women in History, that will be in September, and some things on rural Chinatowns and varied sites also coming up in about half a year from now. But very importantly, very important for our identity and sense of purpose, the foundation wants to build and strengthen community within our own neighborhood. That's within the DMV and the DC Chinatown. Our core activity revolves around concepts of talk story. It is this gathering together, such as today, and through projects such as the context study. And despite all the continued blather about disappearing shops and residents in Chinatown through gentrification, our community stays alive through these type of events. It is the gathering together, the remembering, and the sharing of stories that allows Chinatown to stay alive. Now, our capabilities come first from ourselves, using our own voices to tell stories, and from the collaborations that we build with our new friends and old friends and people who've been with us for a while. This context study, and Michelle is going to explain further, draws support from a number of organizations. And these are some of the few people that do these. They include the DC Preservation League, the Smithsonian Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, and the Department of Interior. I wanted to single out a book which in many ways, this was written several years ago, and that was done with the Department of Interior to talk about underserved communities that were looking for, oh, thank you. Anyway, looking for monuments and landmarks, trying to identify those that have been underrepresented. And there was an Asian American book which is compiling this thing. So if you have a chance, take a look at it. If you want the copy, it's really heavy, but you can't possibly so you can mail it too. But you know, I wanted to mention that book because it turns me to the so critical importance of individuals, such as each of you, that make the difference between what we do, what we can do. You guys, I want to thank each of you for the encouragement to us at the foundation ever since we started, and that was almost 12 years ago. And I can remember when we were just doing talk story programs here. And the other two people were like my and some friends. But it's good to see you guys are here, all here. Individuals make a difference. And it leads me to remember one person I have always felt was here. Come on in over here. There's places to sit. You guys want to sit down over there? And one of those persons is Franklin Odo. Now, I always will associate with him as the director for the APEC program at Smithsonian. But of course, he's been doing a lot of things for that was through either whether at the Asian division of the Library of Congress or at the Amherst. But, you know, Franklin edited, guided that book. And he's also guided us from the very beginning. He's guided me from the very beginning. And he was always our academic advisor in almost all the grant proposals and projects 1882 Foundation undertook. Such amount of knowledge and company. He was just that kind of a friend. And despite his passing a year ago, and despite having trying to come to terms with it at the Smithsonian's annual Day of Remembrance, you know, I really don't know if I feel like I've actually come to terms with his passing. He was that kind of guy. And actually, it may be that the better way to look at it, he is still among us. He seems still here, guiding us and guiding us to uncover, discover, and remember our stories and creating new ones. So individuals make a difference. He does. And thank you, Franklin, thank you for coming here and allowing me to remember Franklin Odo. And I hope that you can be reminded that you are individuals too, who have stories to tell and who can make a difference as well. So with those kind of general remarks, I again want to thank all of you and just remember that you can make a difference. Michelle has also made a difference. So come on up, Michelle, and you can talk about our programs, or at least the content for you.
Thanks, Ted. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Magalong. Hi to the Lee family. And I am an assistant professor at the University of Maryland's Historic Preservation Program, as well as president of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. And so I want to welcome you for coming here to the Chinese Community Church here in Chinatown, for coming in. I also want to thank the Ben de Guzman and the office of Mayor's Office of Asian Pacific Islander Affairs. I think that's the right acronym. But also I want to thank University of Maryland and APIAHiP for having me. But I want to give a little bit of a context of what is a context study. I feel like you guys are my students. As I often have to do an introduction of like, what are we doing here? As Ted had lifted up, there's a book that we are working with in inspiration. And I just want to start off, I always start off a talk with, I ask the question, how many times have you seen this marker? If you want to raise your hand. And if you want to say out loud where you've seen it. At the National Building Museum, which is a National Historic Landmark and listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Oftentimes people say Golden Gate Bridge, Statue of Liberty, the White House. And then I want to ask the question of how many of you have seen the same marker that's associated with Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, or Pacific Islanders? And this one I have here is from Little Tokyo. In Los Angeles, next to City Hall. And when I was running a summer program with interns, I would have them go on a scavenger hunt. And this is actually harder to find than a Pokemon Go. This is on the Union Church for the Center for the Arts. Oftentimes students don't see it. It's actually next to a plaque for a historic grapefruit tree that has been growing and providing fruit since the late 1800s. And those, so a tree in a church, like what is the significance? So I think this is something that Dr. Franklin Odo, when I first met him in 2012, he approached me about serving on an advisory to create this big purple book. He said, there's only out of the 3,000 listings of National Historic Landmarks, NHLs, not to be mistaken for ice hockey, but NHLs, there's only 3,000 listings in the country. And of the 3,000 listings, there's only less than 1% are associated with Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, or Pacific Islanders. And for Franklin, who his home state was Hawaii, he went to look and see how many NHLs are in the state of Hawaii. And it goes from prehistoric time to World War II. And for him, he was just like, that is not the history of the state of Hawaii, right? We need to do a better job in guiding the federal government into landmarking our histories. And it's similar on the National Register of Historic Places. Out of, I think there's 90,000 listings right now. Out of that, there's only like 1.1% are associated with Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. But at the time with Franklin, it was less than 1%. And he wanted to, help address these issues of disparity. And so, these were the places that we thought of: Hanford Alley, China Alley in Hanford, California. The Japanese YWCA it's listed on the National Register. It's located in San Francisco. Little Manila in Stockton, California. This is a photo of one of the 3 remaining buildings that we saved in 2003. The third one was demolished due to owner neglect. Little Tokyo Historic District in Los Angeles. Angel Island Detention Station in San Francisco, and south of Marcos Soma, Filipinas, a cultural district in San Francisco. So Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, for at least the last 30 to 40 years, we've been working on saving our places. We're in Chinatown. Oftentimes people know about Chinatown. They know about the Friendship Gate, right? And, as Ted was mentioning, many people use the narrative of Chinatown to China Block. We need to, kind of break that narrative. And so this was a moment for us. DC Preservation League applied for a grant for the National Park Service Underrepresented Communities Grant to do more work following the precedents of Dr. Odo in creating this book. So this book guides federal agencies. So FEMA to the Interior to EPA, they all have to reference this book before they start to break ground and develop. Right. And so there had to be other ways to inform state agencies and city agencies. And so they created this fund, and DC Preservation League put out a proposal for someone to write the history of Chinese American and Korean Americans here in Washington, DC. I had just happened to move here from California in 2019. And when the proposal came out, and Ted had approached me and Sojin and Jen Lowe, she was here. Hi, Jen. We were the initial team, and we had said, sure, we'll do it. And so we drafted the proposal. DC Preservation League approved it, which was interesting because we started a month before COVID. So a month before COVID. It was an amazing moment where we were like, we're going to go out in the community. We're going to, table events. We're going to do all this. We're going to go out and do interviews. COVID hit. And we were like, what do we do? Many of you are familiar with governmental contracts. You can't delay them. So we had to pivot. And we had to think about this monumental task about writing Chinese American and Korean American history in Washington, D.C. I mentioned that I had just moved here from 2019 from California, where it was this moment I said to Sojin, isn't there a book or something? And Sojin was like, there's no book. And I was like, isn't there a book on Chinese American history in Washington, D.C.? And she's like, there's no book. I come from Los Angeles where, you know, coming from UCLA, there's like 20 books on the same topic published every year, you know? So I said, what do you mean no, there's no books? And so Sojin and I were given the task of like, how do you start to write this? And so we had to look at issues of immigration, migration policy, labor and discrimination, diplomacy, international relations, gender and family dynamics, generational and out-migration growth, cultural and social histories and traditions here in DC, cultural enclaves or ethnic enclaves and socio-cultural institutions, and issues of suburbanization and gentrification that have shaped our community's histories. And so what you see here, if you grab, I think there's a few brochures, hard copies, and there's some posters here. This is a pamphlet. I feel like it's kind of a little, it's a deliverable of our body of work as a team, where we've pulled together some places of interest, right? As we started to map the question of where are Asian American places? And those are the questions we asked at the DC Humanities Truck, which is gone now. But, you know, we were asking the question of where's your history here in DC, right? And so we started to explore with our team and see what that looks like. And so you can see here, there's a QR code too that can give you the tour of where to go. And, you know, we invite you to let us know, is there a place that's missing? Right? Is there a place that we may have overlooked? We're not saying this is the end all be all. This is just some of the best, you know, not the best. I don't want to say we ranked it. There was no ranking. It was just like, these are some cool spots. But, you know, we thought like there has to be other places. And this was something for me as a Filipino American. I thought, are there other places? Right? And this is where I learned about Manila House as a place that could potentially be landmarked, and the Chinese Lantern Restaurant. So, you know, these are places that you may want to look at and check out. Like Manila House has a plaque. So that's your Pokemon Go. And so we were really fortunate with our team that we got to, particularly with my team from the University of Maryland, I was able to support students to come through my program and start to look at this work of like, what does this mean for us to get more landmarks on the National Register? So this included us looking at the Onlyong Merchants Association here in Chinatown. This is a site. This is Hongsadon in Los Angeles, which was happening at the same time as we were writing this project. So we were really inspired by what was happening with Hongsadon, which was threatened for demolition by a developer, but the Korean government intervened and purchased it. And so it was funny is Hongsadon made an announcement. The Korean government made a press release and said, this is the first building that's associated with the Korean government that's owned by the Korean government. And we were like, wait, no, take that back, because the old Korean Legation building is actually the first, right? And so actually the Korean Legation building and Hongsadon have, you know, related histories to each other. So they're learning from each other. So we were able to go back and consult with our team in Los Angeles and say, you know, we need to have a better inclusion of its connections of Hongsadon and the Korean Legation building. So you're going to be hearing a little bit, you're going to meet our team actually. Our team, it's a mighty crew of us who have been working together to write these stories, to capture your stories. And if you were here earlier, we'll be asking you, you'll be noticing that we're writing notes as you tell us stories. So, and, you know, don't be afraid. We're actually really interested of like, what is this place, the Chinese Community Church, Chinatown, DC mean to you? What are places of significance? And so, like I met with Evelyn Lee, she told me about, she's like, my husband and I met here through the church. They got married at the L Street location, but she's like, her photo is in the hallway, right? That's her story, right? Her son and daughter-in-law are in the photo. So that's the power of these stories, is that we want to tell these stories to these agencies to say our stories matter, our places matter, and we invite you to tell us more and for you to sit back and relax and enjoy the flurry of presentations you're going to be hearing next. And I want to introduce Sojin Kim, my co-conspirator. He's curator. She's not only my board member at APIAHiP, but she is curator at the Smithsonian Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, and she'll be emceeing this next round. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. I want to reiterate that, and maybe you noticed, there are no breaks in this program. So we always meant for this to feel informal, like you were at your family slideshow, vacation slideshow. So you should feel free, get up at any point, use the bathroom, stretch your legs, stretch yourself, get food, get a drink, refill your beverage, but please, there are no breaks. You're gonna have to take care of yourself here, and we encourage you to do this. We will not be offended. So I wanted to first let you see just this rambling and decentralized and actually very interdisciplinary team that's been working together, contributing to this context statement. We are students such as Ella right over here, who worked with us last year. We are people working in public history and landscape, architecture and historic preservation and public history. Lots and lots of different people have helped and contributed. We are so grateful. We're grateful to our advisors, and we're grateful for people who also have just been talking to us. Many of you are in this room who've been sharing your expertise. You've been sharing the fact that you know some of these sites and these histories way better than we do. Some of them are also going to be presenting later on. So it takes a lot of different people. It takes a lot of different information. It takes many iterations to actually pull something like this together. This is very much a work in progress. I also want to shout out Grace, Kwon, and Keani Lee, who have worked on some of the images that you've seen cycling through, and you'll see it again later. We'll have this 2 slideshows up, but they pulled together images from our research and they put them into these videos, which we hope you'll get a chance to look at. And we are thinking about some other way to make these available, because the images that people have shared with us are truly incredible. Some of them came out of archives like the National Archives or the Gelman-Lambert GW, the USC Korean American Digital Archive, but most of the images actually from our research come from private collections. They come from organizations, they come from individuals, they come from families. And so we so value the fact that people are sharing these things with us, because what we see in their materials are incredibly important visual evidence of these long-term relationships of Asian Americans to the DC landscape. So we're going to move on now, and you are going to have to really hold on to your seat, because we're going to try to do this really fast. We wanted to introduce you to a variety of different stories. They are not all the stories that we're going to document in the report, but there are some of them. And we are not putting this in any kind of chronological order, because we wanted to impress upon you the fact that you can come at this history about Asian Americans in DC from many different angles. You can frame it from the level of the individual, or from the family, from the occupation, from the event, from a specific location or neighborhood or a topic. We wanted to just give you a sense of that you can get at this history. There's lots of different access points. So this first group of presentations, which again, we're going to drive through really quickly, are going to be followed then by another set of presentations by colleagues who have been working in other communities besides Chinese and Korean American in DC, and we really wanted them to share the work that they've been doing. We wanted you to see that this is endless. There's so much more that could be done. So I am going to start by introducing our colleague, Meng-Shu Ye, who worked with us last year, when she was a student actually at GEMS at American University. She has since moved to California, Santa Barbara, but we really appreciate her zooming in to share with you the research she did around Chinese traditional medicine. I also want to shout out Gabby, too, who is running all the tech for us.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you, Meng-Shu.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Sojin. Yeah, as Sojin mentioned, I was a public history graduate student at AU, and that's when I had the opportunity of working on this project. So you can go to the next slide, please. So my portion of the research focuses on the health and medicine aspect of the AAPI community, specifically of Chinese community in DC. In particular, I examined the development of traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, since the 1970s in DC, recognizing the sort of interconnectedness between its local and national evolution. Next slide, please. So in 1897, DC's earliest records reviews the presence of TCM, but it received very limited coverage until the 1970s, which was a very transformative era of TCM in the US. because the reestablishment of US and China relations in 1972 played a really significant role in the rise of TCM. So TCM captured the public interest through, in New York Times, James Reston, there's this very influential article on his acupuncture experience in China, which kind of triggered this so-called acupuncture fever nationwide. And this nationwide interest also reflected locally in DC. So in 1972, the Washington Acupuncture Center was established in DC near I Street and 18th Street. It was the first acupuncture clinic that's legal in the US. Dr. Yao Li, one of the founders, as you can see his picture here on top, working with a patient. So the center had a mix of Chinese practitioners trained in TCM in China, and also non-Chinese doctors trained in Western medicine serve as supervisors to the practice. And the center was very popular at the time. Patients from all over the country would came to visit, and at its height, it had around 250 patients per day. And in 1974, the center went through a lawsuit over practicing rights after home rule was enacted in DC. And the center eventually won the case. So its existence as the first legal acupuncture clinic in the US had a really significant impact in DC. Ever since it was established in 1702, 11 additional acupuncture clinics also emerged in DC in 73 and 74. Next slide, please. Thank you. So throughout the 1970s, Chinese and non-Chinese acupuncture practitioners or supporters struggled to legalize the use of acupuncture, and their collective efforts were showcased in congressional hearings, DC council hearings, and court cases as they defended the continued use of acupuncture. And their efforts led to the use of acupuncture well into the 90s, and as a result, in 1989, DC published its first acupuncture regulation, which marked a very significant milestone. And additionally, I just want to highlight two examples of TCM's lasting impact in DC. First one is Dr. Wu Shihua, who was trained in China, arrived in DC in 1992, and established a TCM and acupuncture clinic on the 6th Street near Chinatown. Another example is Dr. Arthur Fan, pictured here on the right, whom I had an opportunity of interviewing. Dr. Fan, who came to the US in early 2000s and obtained his license to practice, and he has contributed extensively to the research and publications of the history of TCM in the US. And he also shared his extensive knowledge with me during the interview. So overall, in recent years, acupuncture has continued to become deeply rooted in DC area, with a significant increase of numbers of clinics and training schools. And with that, that's a part of my research. Thank you.
What I also wanted to mention is we're on Instagram. That's one way we pivoted. And we started thinking about how can we feature historic people, places, and events in DC using social media. And so, interestingly enough, for me, I want to talk about the work that we've done with the Lee family. When I first started off, I had a friend of mine, Sandy Lee, was living in Los Angeles, and he's born and raised in DC. And he would always tell me, he's like, I don't know, my parents are going to some gold medal event. And I was like, are you talking about the Chinese American Congressional Gold Medal? And he was like, yeah, he's like so blasé. And I was like, is it your dad's side or your mom's side? And he's like, both. And I was like, Sandy, that's a big deal, right? And he's like, and so I was like, I need to know more about your family. And so Sandy was like, dear Aunt Sue and Mom, this is Michelle. She wants to know about Dad and Grandpa's both on Lee's, they're both Lee's, and to hear more about their story. And so I started to, hear more and more. And then Sandy told me the Safeway on Columbia Street, which is where I would go grocery shopping during COVID. He was like, yeah, my grandpa had a laundromat across the street, right? And I was like, what is this history? So I started asking questions. And so it was an interesting moment. It was a time of COVID. And we had worked with Kathy, what's her last name again? Chung, over at MEEPS in Adams Morgan. For those who may have heard, she had posted on Instagram that she was harassed. She faced an incident of anti-Asian hate in her vintage shop. And it was this moment where, and Adams Morgan Day was coming up. Adams Morgan Day organizers asked us, do you guys want a table? And we were like, we feel like we should talk about what's happened at MEEPS and to talk about this AAPI hate that's going on. And, and I said, hey, Sandy's grandpa had a laundry in Adams Morgan too. So it was a way that we wanted to say Asian Americans have been here. We've been here for quite some time. We've had, families come here and establish themselves and really create a presence. And so I reached out to the Lee family and said, tell me your story. And so Auntie Evelyn and Aunt Sue started to tell me the story of their father, how he was in the Army in World War II. And this is just some photos of us hanging out. These are images that we had printed and that Kathy had posted. She created this storefront display. And there's also a slideshow in the video of the different images that we collected from residents, shop owners, and folks who had created a place in Adams Morgan, Columbia Heights, and Mount Pleasant. And so this is Evelyn and Phil, who are there in the back. And Tony Padua, who he started to tell me his story of his parents who met in the Philippine embassy. She was a maid, he was a butler. They got married and had kids. And they started talking. They just started hanging out and telling their stories. And, I then met my students. You'll meet Emma. My student Emma, she came to me as a first year and I said, I have a project for you. Can you do some research for me? Can you research I Thin Lee, right? And so Emma's like, okay, sure. So she looks it up. And correct me if I'm wrong, Emma, in your process. And she looks up and she finds his journey in the public records and the National Archives. So she starts to find where it traces back his moment into the United States. And then Evelyn and Sue shared with me their photos of their father in the Army, and complete with captions. We didn't take those away. And we started to see his records here, where he is listed as serving in the armed forces in 1943. So we, not that we questioned, their authority, but we wanted to see the public record of what is there. And we found it on ancestry.com. And then we started asking stories. I spoke to Sandy. He would talk to me. There was a moment he came to DC. He walked with me down Columbia Road and he was like, see that little corner spot next to McDonald's? My grandpa used to take me there. We would go get ice cream and we would just play on what I thought this was a massive park. It's just like a little patch of grass, right? And he would say, my grandpa would just watch me and my twin brother, Alex. And so, we took that walk around Adams Morgan and Columbia Road, trying to get that story. And as Sandy was telling me the story, I was writing it all down. And then I would email Aunt Sue and I was like, Aunt Sue, is this correct? So I was like double verifying information. And so then we started to write the narrative of him, right? How he came from China. He had married his wife in China and he had one daughter in China. And then when he came to Washington, D.C., and after he had served, he was actually honorably discharged as he had an injury, a leg injury. And he started in the late 1940s, Lee's Sanitary Laundry on Cedar Street, in what is now Tacoma Park, near where the metro station is. And then after he moved from Tacoma Park, he went to Adams Morgan, and actually that building is still there. During this time when we were writing this narrative, it went up for sale. And so I don't know what it is anymore. I haven't gone grocery shopping in a while. And so, so we started to piece together, like, what is this story of this family, right? And I said, Sandy, you have a dynamic family history, right? And it's been amazing. The Lee family has invited me over for Christmas. I've gotten to see their collage of family photos. I've gotten to meet the entire Lee family, which has been amazing, and hear more stories of their family history. So it's been this amazing moment, and these images you just saw is what we have on Instagram. So you can see we've covered it on historic people, places, and events that you can check out. So I just want to thank Sandy Lee, Lisa Hasagawa, Phil and Evelyn, Aunt Sue, and to our researcher, Emma. And I want to pass this along to Grace Kwon. Grace is a doctoral student in American Studies at University of Maryland.
Hi, thank you. I have a lot, so I have to go really fast. With the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943 and the passing of the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, the DC area saw an increase in Korean immigration. The 1960s and 70s was a period of local community growth and development for Korean Americans around the district. As the population grew, so did the need for organizations that met the basic needs of the community, such as help with translation and immigration paperwork, housing and job searches. But the Korean community also organized Korean language and culture schools, fundraisers for scholarships, nursing homes, business-related organizations, and cultural programs. Some of these organizations included the Korean Community Service Center of Greater Washington, which was started in 1973 by Reverend Chung Yun Chart of Washington Korean Presbyterian Church. This advertisement was published in the Miju Hangul Ilbo, the local Korean language newspaper, in August of 1975 for the center's facility, which provided help with the family issues, education, medical care, marriage, and job searches, and counseling. Another service organization was the Korean American Scholarship Foundation, which was founded in 1968 in DC by members of the Korean United Methodist Church. It has now become one of the largest Korean American national scholarship organizations in the US, with 7 regional chapters. This photo is of a meeting during the beginning years of the organization and includes Walter Park, who's standing in the photo, who helped to start the organization with money raised by the Korean Students Association. On December 9th, 1950, Walter Park also invited several students to come together, and they ended up forming the Korean Social Club. This group would later become the Korean American Association of Greater Washington, D.C., which is still an active community organization today based in Annandale, Virginia. This is a photo taken at this, oh no, one of my slides is missing. Okay. It was a bunch of people at the Smithsonian Institute in December of 1969 during a dinner and dance party. The Korean American Women's Association was made up of Korean women married to American men, and it helped them to support one another in their new lives in the US. They started in July of 1963 as a social club, but developed into a service organization, providing assistance to incoming Korean women to help them adapt to American life. So this photo is of the Korean American Women's Association's New Year's Eve party on December 31st, 1972. Chung-Won Lee Weeder, who was seen dancing on the left, was the organization's president from 1972 to 1973. And the Korean American Women's Society branched out from this association in 1981, and they recently celebrated their 50th anniversary. Oh, that's the photo of the Korean Association. With the increase of Korean American immigration to the DC area during the 1960s came the need for organizations that went beyond the essential needs of the community. These new organizations focus more on specialized community or professional organizations and leisurely activities one can enjoy during off-work hours, such as sports teams. So this is Duck Jun Lee, also known as Duck Lee, was the athletics director for the Korean Students Association in 1961, and he saw the need for a Korean baseball team. So Lee founded the Korean Tigers in the early mid-1960s, which was comprised of local Korean Americans and recent immigrants. They would later join the Maryland, Virginia, and DC Industrial League for one season in the late 1960s. The Industrial League was a precursor to the collegiate circuit that had both college and former professional players in its ranks for 4 decades beginning in the 1960s. According to Billy Harris, a former Industrial League All-Star, Duck was, quote, very proud of the Korean Tigers, and he would light up every time he spoke about them. Unfortunately, the team only played one season after having to forfeit because some of the players could not make the rigorous game schedule during the week because of their work. So Lee continued to bring together the local Korean American community, but this time by setting up a series of matches between the National Korean Amateur Baseball Team and the Industrial League. These games were played in 1975, 1977, 1979, and 1987. It was the first year was chosen to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the establishment of the Korean government after freedom from annexation from Japan. So Lee was working with the Korean government to bring over these players. He served as a translator and even found them housing with local Korean American families. These games drew in 500 local fans, including around 200 Korean Americans from the DC and Baltimore area. The team celebrated this collaboration with dinners hosted by the Korean Embassy and the Korean Ambassador's residence on Connecticut Avenue. So Lee saw baseball as an instrument to bring pleasure, friendship, harmony, and mutual respect to people of diverse backgrounds and culture. Lee said, as I have gotten deeper and deeper into baseball, I have realized the enormous strength of baseball. Baseball is strong because it brings people who don't speak the same language together. So to all the wonderful people who have contributed their knowledge, time, and efforts to this project, 감사합니다. 미국 내 한인 사회의 발전을 위해 노력 중이고 앞으로 더 노력하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Hey everyone, I'm back. This time, I'm going to talk about some of the research that I got to do for this project. So mine was mainly on the topics of Chinese Community Church as well as veterans, which I got to talk a lot with Evelyn Moy and the Moy Family Association about. But since we are here in the church today, I thought it'd be apt to talk about the building that we are in and its community. So before kind of going deeper into it, I want to also acknowledge some of the people that I've really gotten to work with, gotten to know through this project, including Walter and Shirley Liu, Jennings Wong, Michelle Wong, Little Wong, and many other CCC members who have been really gracious with their time and getting to let us have a chat with them about their history. We also got to attend one of the Sunday school classes, or a couple of Sunday school classes at the CCC. And it was really fun to hear some people's testimonies and their experiences growing up in the area. So as we all know today, we are right now meeting in this facility. However, the church has not always been in this building, as many of you know. Since its founding in 1935, it has relocated to several locations because of its growing, because of growing a growing congregation and also just adapting to the needs of the Chinese American community here in DC. So one of the first things that you kind of hear about when you talk about the CCC is its founding pastor named Reverend C.C. Hung. So he played a very large role in kind of shaping the church community, both along lines of faith as well as promoting cultural heritage among Chinese Americans here in DC and making sure they had access to like language classes and cultural classes and stuff like that was largely part of his mission and kind of bringing that into the church community. And then when it was first founded, it was kind of founded with the help of a lot of other Protestant churches and support from Protestant churches in the area, which formed this kind of board of directors, which you see here in this slide. You can see Reverend C.C. Hung in the middle. But yeah, so after its founding and after the church kind of continued to grow and establish its own independence, it later, the board of directors later went out, and then it kind of became its own autonomous entity after that, which I think is pretty cool. So some of these pictures I was able to get from Jennings actually show some of the earlier buildings of the CPC. So this first one here was actually one of its first locations. So originally it met at Mount Vernon Place Methodist Episcopal Church, kind of renting space there, and then moved into a townhouse at 1011 L Street, which is no longer a townhouse now. You probably recognize it more like this picture over here, which is a hotel. But originally it was a townhouse, and they met in this little room right here. And then as the community grew, they decided to continue fundraising to establish a new building, which is one you see over here. And it was purpose-built to serve as community space. And so in addition to kind of creating these like connections between like Mount Vernon Episcopal or Mount Vernon Place Methodist Episcopal Church, there's also a strong presence with Calvary Baptist Church and helping kind of the community grow around in the area. Another kind of aspect that I talked to Jennings a lot about was the church's role during World War II and kind of the social groups and the things that the church provided to serve the community's needs at the time. So especially during World War II, when there were a lot of Chinese American veterans coming into the area, there was the development of kind of a informal united service organization. They would hold services as well as kind of these social events, which you can see here, which we believe was taken at a YMCA in the DC area, although we're still trying to confirm that. But it kind of just is another example of the ways that the church adapted to and created spaces for people to both socialize and spend time together within the Chinese American community around here in DC. Another kind of fun picture is this one here, which is of a banner that is we're not really sure where it is located, but when these Chinese American service people came into DC, they would add a star on the flag for each of them. And it's kind of fun to see throughout the pictures the number of stars grow to represent the people who came through here. And then the kind of final aspect of the CCC I want to talk about was its role as a community service organization. So in one way, it was both an educational center by providing Sunday school classes and English classes and homework help and stuff like that for school-age kids, both elementary and high school, through the Tiongson project specifically, and creating partnerships through that. And as well as the Chinatown Service Center, which does not have a specific religious affiliation, but also provides a lot of help as far as like welfare, service type things, like helping people with taxes, helping with translation services and things like that. So this is just a really small like snapshot of all the kind of things that the Chinese Church has done to help serve the community, which I think has been really fun to hear about from its community members. But yeah, unfortunately, this is all the time I have to talk about it. I could talk about this all day, but I just want to extend a thank you to the church members who extended their time to me to learn a little bit more about this really cool organization.
Yeah, thank you again to the church. We're so appreciative. It's so great to be here. I love seeing people get up and get food, so please keep doing that. So I'm Sojin again. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to try to do this. I'm kind of trying to figure out how to change these slides and look at my notes at the same time. All right, I'm going to talk about DC sites that are related to the Korean independence movement. So these are a series of activities that were mobilized across the diaspora after the Korean Peninsula was annexed by Japan in 1910. So I'm going to start you here with this photo. This shows a gathering of independence activists, essentially, in Philadelphia in April 1919. This is the image we're looking at on the left. And the primary organizer was this man, Philip Jason, that's the name he took in English, who was a doctor, he was a publisher. He was also, by this time, a naturalized US citizen. He had been a naturalized US citizen for almost 30 years by this time. And his work in service for Korean independence was recognized in the statue that you see to the right, your right, that was dedicated in 2008 in front of the Korean consulate in DC. And this makes a lot of sense, right? He's being recognized for this role he has internationally. But I feel like there's this really interesting local logic to having this statue of Philip Jason in DC, because although he raised his family in Pennsylvania, he lived in Pennsylvania probably for most of his time in the US, he spent quite a significant amount of time in Washington, DC. There are many addresses associated with Philip Jason between the 1880s until the turn of the last century. He got his medical degree in Washington, D.C. He was licensed to be a medical doctor in D.C. He married his wife here. So for me, this statue is one of the most literal markers related to Korean American history in D.C. But there are also other notable D.C. sites that I want to flag for you that are related to both Jason and the independence movement, but also another very prominent, albeit divisive leader, Syngman Rhee, R-H-E-E, who would later become the first president of the, oops, that's Philip Jason there. And there we go, that's Syngman Rhee. He became the first president of the Republic of Korea. He and Jason often worked together, but he also saw great productivity in locating himself in Washington, D.C., because here he could be close to lawmakers. Here he could also be close to people of influence and people of means. So for example, in 1919, he established the Korean Commission in DC to manage fundraising for independence activities. And for at least 3 years, the Korean Commission operated from the 9th floor of this ornate downtown DC office building at the corner of H and 14th. And these are really beautiful photos showing outside and the interior of the space. These are from a collection of photos of Henry Chung-Diong, who was a young associate of Ri. And these photographs are digitized as part of the USC Korean American Digital Archive. They're really extraordinary. And then here are some photos from another series of images in Henry Chung-Diong's collection that, again, are available through the Korean American Digital Archive. But these show activities related to another property. This is actually a house on 16th Street near Thomas Circle. And this served as a base of operation for efforts to intervene in an international naval disarmament conference that was held in DC, and in which the US and Japan were going to be participating. And so this group, what they wanted to do is they were trying to get their delegation invited to the conference so that they could raise the issue of Korea's loss of sovereignty before these influential world powers, these military powers. Sadly, this never came to be. The campaign actually was not successful and they were not invited to the table. I'm going to flash forward now 2 decades. Upper 16th Street, this house was purchased by Syngman Rhee in the early 1940s, and it served as his residence, but it was also where he tried to revive the Korean Commission, which had actually laid dormant in DC for most of the 1930s. And then on the right, what you see are these cherry trees, this particularly Korean variant of cherry trees that Syngman Rhee planted at American University in 1943 in a ceremony essentially to assert Korea's cultural autonomy and distinctiveness in face of their colonization by Japan. And he used the symbol of cherry trees, right, because of the very strong association that people have with this landscape of the Japanese cherry trees down at the tidal basin. For those of you who are interested, 3 of these 4 trees that he planted still bloom in the spring on the AU campus of Nebraska. And then the final image I want to flag for you is the Korean church in Washington, standing in front of Foundry Methodist Church on 16th Street, where they were in residence for almost 3 decades. So this was the first Korean Christian congregation that was organized in DC. They were first organized in 1951, and most of the original organizers were actually Presbyterian. But at the time, this is what I have heard, the Presbyterian governing body would not permit non-English language services within their buildings. So instead of going to a Presbyterian church, these mostly Presbyterians went to Foundry, which was a Methodist church. And it's here that they stayed for 30 years, likely invited in by the church's minister, Reverend Harris, who had known Syngman Rhee in the 1930s. Rhee had attended services at the church. And even during World War II, the Foundry hosted a gathering of independence activists who gathered in DC in 1942. So I'm just going to conclude really quickly and just say, I think that there is something interesting to be found in thinking about the Korean independence movement as foundational for telling actually Korean American stories in the DC region. This Korean congregation based at Foundry helped to anchor the growing post-World War II and then later post-1965 Korean community. And I think, and that community stayed there until 1979 before outgrowing the space, moving to Virginia. And this is a congregation that continues to thrive and worship there today. I am now going to pass the mic on to my colleague Wei Gan, who for many months during the darkest days of COVID led us through this project.
Hi, that is a very bright light. All right, so my name is Wei. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here this afternoon. I've been working with APIAHiP for about 2 years now, and I'm here to tell you about Range 99 at Congressional Cemetery. So since 1807, historic Congressional Cemetery in Southeast Washington, D.C. has been a final resting place for people of all professions, social positions, and ages, including both Confederate and Union soldiers from the Civil War. Marion Barry, former mayor of DC. On the right is Leonard Philip Matlovich, the first openly gay member of the U.S. military. There's also Push Mataha and Taza, both of whom are Native American chieftains. And then J. Edgar Hoover of FBI fame. And on the right are the Hollister's, who are a pair of madams in DC. There's a very funny story behind that. And then there's also John Philip Sousa, and his birthday is celebrated every year at the Congressional Cemetery with a march and performance by the Marine Corps Band. So with all of these interesting and historic figures buried here, many educational, commemorative, and community events are carried out at the cemetery throughout the year. And the cemetery was also registered as a National Historical Landmark in 2011. However, very few people know about Range 99. So what is Range 99? It's a strip of land that is right there up against the back wall there, at the back of the cemetery. And today it is next to the DC jail in the back. But between 1896 and 1938, nearly 100 Chinese were buried here. They were among the first migrants from China to DC, and they first lived and worked in DC's first Chinatown, which is today's Federal Triangle, and then later moved to where Chinatown is now. And because of the Chinese exclusion laws and a series of other racist policies, these men were mostly single because they either couldn't bring their families over to the US or they couldn't marry. So when they passed away, mutual benefit organizations such as family associations and district associations took care of their affairs. So here are some records from the Congressional Cemetery. This is from 1917. You'll see where I highlighted 99 is where it's interred. Here's one from 1918, right? And then also one from 1920. And I just want to point out here in this column, it's name of undertaker, and it says J. William Lee and Sons. And this is important, so remember that for later. So these are some newspaper articles from the time about these burials. So the one on the left, do we have any Moys in the house? They were here. But the first one on the left is from 1910, and it's a burial notification for Joe Moy. The one on the right is from 1915, and it's for Li Yong. And what's really interesting about these burials is that because of the funerary customs of the time, the remains are actually later disinterred or exhumed according to Chinese tradition, and then shipped back to China for reburial where their families could provide for essential ancestral rites. So here are some records of the disinterment. Down at the bottom here, you'll notice 1927, March 15th, began a whole series of collective disinterments. And once again, I want to point out the lead here for undertaker. So here is a record for Li Yong, whose obituary you guys saw before. This is his disinterment record. And then this is for Joe Moy as well. So this is a news story, not the rummage sale, but on the right hand side. So it's on page 9, guys. So this is from, next slide, please. This is from February 1st, 1909. And on this day, 22 Chinese were disinterred. And so that gives quite a bit of detail and even lists some names, mostly Lees and Moys here. So kind of to wrap up and bring us back here to the present, Congressional Cemetery is full of stones and memorials dating from the earliest times in America, each with its own story of lives that have contributed to the larger American narrative. But Range 99 is empty because remember the photo I showed you earlier, it was just that strip of grass. There are no longer any Chinese remains at the site. There's not even a remnant of a gravestone there. And the contrast of the emptiness of Range 99 is notable. It's as if the Chinese were never there, as if their stories did not matter in the over 200 years of American history represented at the cemetery. So in 2015, 1882 Foundation, together with Chinese American Citizens Alliance, Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, got together and installed 2 benches and a plaque there to commemorate the site. However, the wall later collapsed and then the tree fell and then other things happened. So it's been under a state of disrepair for a few years. But if you remember earlier when I was showing you about the undertakers, the J. William Lee and Sons, it turns out that all of the funerals starting in 1896 for Chinese were conducted by Lee Funeral Homes, which is currently today still in operation. 125 years later, and his current president, C. William Lee III, actually donated the cemetery plot at Range 99 to 1882. So we were able to rebuild the memorial last year. And just keep cycling. And then we were able to hold a dedication ceremony last April, and we planted a crepe myrtle tree, also a ginkgo tree. Oh, they have leaves now. But to continue to remember and to honor the Chinese who were here, we are doing a brick sponsorship program. So you can have names of your loved ones, your organization, people you care about, causes you care about, engraved on these red bricks. And then here, more of a close-up. So these central pavers, they depict ancestral districts in China. So my last slide really is close up with the plaque here. It says to honor those who were here, and here is if you head to the QR code, there's more information about sponsorships at the cemetery. But I encourage everyone to go visit. It's a great place.
I want to introduce our community partners. We wanted to include some of our colleagues who can speak to some of these places better than us. There's been a change in the program. Harry Chow is unable to come, and he was going to be talking about the 1970s Chinatown community organizations. So we hope that you'll have an opportunity to hear from him in the future. But right now, I'd like to introduce Michelle Cho, who is the Public Relations Manager at the Korean Legation building.
Hello, everybody. My name is Michelle Cho. Thank you, Grace, for introducing me today. And also thank you, Sojin, and as well as the 1882 Foundation for inviting us here today to speak on the Korean Legation building. So we are operated by the Cultural Heritage Administration as well as the Overseas Korean Cultural Heritage Foundation. And this is kind of the exterior of what our museum looks like. It's an illustration, but it looks pretty similar to the image you're seeing here on the left. This is a map of 1892's Washington, D.C. And this is also something that we do have inside of one of our office spaces during our House and Museum visitations. You can find us at 15 Logan Circle Northwest, and it's still at the Golden Triangle District of Washington, D.C. here. We still have due to COVID, we still have a reservation-based visitation system, but that can be found on one of our reservation tabs inside of our website. So I wanted to speak a little bit on why this is sort of important. You can find some of our postcards on this table over here, as well as a sign-up table over there. After this building was sold to Imperial Japan in 1910, the Koreans that were residing in the United States sought out to create these postcards in relations to to showing the passion for Korean independence as well as political sovereignty. And so they had exaggerated the Korean flag you see here on the postcard. These are still in circulation. And if you visit our museum, we still have them circulated today. And we do still send them out in order to preserve its legacy in relation to having it be circulated. And so this is what you see here on the left is the image of the Korean Legation building previously, around the 1800s, as well as this one is the one when it was restored back in 2015 to 2018, and it was opened to the public for the first time in 2018. And I think as a second generation Korean American, this is very important because it's a powerful symbol that not only represents the friendship between the United States and Korea, but also because it is a form of reclaiming our histories. And after its purchase, having this building still being operated and showcasing to the public and educating to the public about what it stood for and how it continues to stand, I think is a very deep symbol for most Korean Americans. And we have upcoming events. We only host 2 lectures a year. And so we are very excited to introduce Dr. Sojin Kim, Dr. Ji-Hae Choi, that is going to be one of our speakers here today at the Legation. On the 20th, it's going to be housed in the Korean language, as well as the 22nd, that's going to be housed in English. You could purchase these tickets, which are free on Eventbrite using our QR code. It's going to be from 2 to 4 p.m. It's a 2-hour lecture that you guys can join, and we're really excited to see a few friendly faces that we are seeing here today. Thank you so much for your time, everybody.
Thank you, Michelle, from another Michelle. We're going to keep going. We're going to look what's beyond the context statement and beyond our working with our community partners. And up next, I would love to invite our speaker, Rita, Cacas, who will be talking about Filipino American history in Washington, D.C. Rita is a great collaborator who I got to meet at a tabling event with the mayor's office. She was sitting next to me. She's like, "Oh my gosh, we had been meaning to meet each other during COVID, but we're not able to." And so we finally got to meet with this project. And I'm so honored to have Rita. She has a community archive at the University of Maryland that we've been able to utilize. So Rita?
So I had to put my 8-minute slide down to like 6 minutes. So I'm going to try to rush through my slides real fast too. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. A big thanks to Sojin Kim and also to Ted Gong, who I hadn't seen in a while, 1882 Foundation. And thank you, everybody, for your interest in attending our program. So, next slide. Next. Oh, that's my first slide. Okay, so here's my book that was written in 2009, Filipinos in Washington, D.C. It is chronological and tells the story of Filipinos who came here more than 100 years ago, after the U.S. acquired the Philippines in 1898. This was the first large wave of Filipinos to the D.C. area. Today I'll talk about an important landmark for Filipinos here in Washington, D.C. My father came to the U.S. in 1929, and he tried telling us stories about lives of Filipinos during the 1930s and 40s. And but as young kids, we were very young, we didn't understand what he was trying to tell us. So he began showing signs. Later on, when I began to want to listen to him, he started showing signs of dementia. So a few years later, I interviewed my dad, and he described the larger community of Filipinos along with stories that needed to be captured and preserved. So 30 years ago, in 1993, I photographed and recorded about 25 Filipinos who were also in their 80s and 90s. Many of the elders talked about hanging out at the Manila House in Washington, D.C. on K Street. It's a gathering place for mostly Filipino bachelors to get home-cooked meals and to enjoy Saturday night dancing and gambling, of course. But in 1993, the people I interviewed had no photographs of this Manila House. In 2008, when I started writing the book, a family friend said that her grandmother cooked and also managed the Manila House. Had wonderful photos of community gatherings with handwritten notes identifying the Manila House. So this was enough evidence to include in my book. Then we found the Manila House in government records, such as the 1940 census available at National Archives. We also found the 1937 deed for the Manila House, and we'll talk about more of this in just a second. A few years later, another family friend called my mom. Her mother had died a while back, and she was getting ready to throw out stuff that belonged to her parents, but my mom encouraged her to call me. There were 3 tiny pictures dated 1944. And if you can imagine folding a dollar bill into thirds, it was about this size. The 3 photos were about this size. And that's the size of the souvenir portrait of Lena's parents and their friends. And it was in 1944. But look closely at the Manila House is written above the doorway. And this provided evidence of the Manila House at 2422 K Street. And I'm so grateful that Lena did not throw her parents' photos away. Here's another important connection to the Manila House. It's a panoramic photo dated 1933. It's the arrival of the Philippine Independence Delegation taken in front of Union Station. Check out the detail of the banner held by some Filipinos at the bottom of the picture. The event was hosted by the Visayan Circle, which was a DC Filipino club whose members came from the Visayas region in the Philippines. Remember the deed that we just saw? Turns out that this group purchased the Manila House in 1937, 4 years after the Union Station picture was taken. It's a very important picture that has been donated to our community archives at the University of Maryland. We also interviewed some of the sons and daughters of the people who are in the picture, who are now in their 70s and 80s. They helped us identify many of the people in the photo, including at the very center, number 5, Manuel Quezon, who became the first president of the Philippines, and he's carrying a bouquet of flowers that they brought him. So we still have a living connection to the people in that photo, 1933. Then we learned about the literary landmark that ties a special location in the community with a deceased literary figure. In our case, it was, what's my book? There it is. The Filipino author and poet, Benvenido Santos, who lived at the Manila House during the 1940s. And his book even includes a chapter entitled Manila House. So this was really even more incentive for us to get some kind of designation for the building. We applied for the plaque and our project was approved. Here's the plaque that was installed outside of the same doors where Lena's parents stood almost 80 years ago. And that's Mila holding up the plaque. She's the one whose grandmother ran the place and also cooked the meals there. And this is a Google Maps view of what it looks like today. The former Manila House now has a marker that commemorates the early 20th century community of DC, Philippines. And in the last few years, there's been a lot of interest in the Manila House story with new projects emerging. Tracing Manila House is a project by a Filipino artist doing an MFA at George Washington University. Last fall, Tina did charcoal rubbings of the rooms and of the staircase in memory of the Filipinos who walked in these floors. And we're also talking about holding another commemorative event in October, which is Filipino American History Month, and it's Archives Month, so it's kind of a double whammy for us. And here I'm giving a tour of the Community Archives collection at the University of Maryland. And standing on the left next to me is Theo Gonzalez. Sojin, where's I didn't know if he was going to be here today, but he's the director of the Smithsonian, of the APA collection chair. And then seated on the right is Juanita Tamayo, who's my co-author. So I had to kind of race through the slides, and if there are any questions, please contact me, or if you'd like to schedule a tour to come see the Filipino American Community Archives. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rita. And continuing on Filipino American history in DC, I want to invite up Erwin Tiongson. And Erwin, and we, when we saw the call that was on Asian American history, that was specific to Chinese American and Korean American history, a part of us was like, that's not all Asian American history, right? And so we were like, we're gonna find, we knew that in this process, we were gonna learn more about other Asian American ethnicities. And so we were really fortunate, I mean, I am a proud Filipino American, that we were able to learn more about folks doing Filipino American work like Erwin Tiongson.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you to Sojin. Thank you to Ted for inviting me to share my work and my family's work. I'm here to tell you about this book that just got published a couple of months ago. This book grew out of a family project that started over 10 years ago called the Philippines on the Potomac Project. I will say more about that in a second. For now, let me just say that the Philippines on the Potomac Project was made possible by many extraordinary and generous individuals, including Rita Cacas, who's here with us today. Both the family project and the book would not have been possible without Rita's friendship and tireless support over the last 10 years. So thank you so much, Rita. Now, the reason the book exists is the same, I would say, the same essential reason that many of us happen to be here together at this moment here in DC. It is because somehow our lives are part of the intertwined histories of the United States and those of our countries of origin, or our parents and grandparents' countries of origin, spanning, in some cases, over a century. Now, this is my one-slide version of Philippine history, which really I shouldn't be doing. But for our purposes today, let me just say that this history includes this period from 1898 to 1946. It's framed by three wars: the Spanish-American War, which led to the US annexation of the Philippines; a little-known war called the Philippine-American War, which among its casualties included about 10,000 American soldiers and up to 200,000 Philippine civilians. And then finally, towards the end of this period, the Second World War. All of this to say that because the Philippines was a US colony from around 1898 to 1946, it's why there has been such a strong Philippine presence here in the Washington, D.C. area. Now, around fall of 2012, my family and I sat down. We had just come back from the Philippines, and Tichi and I asked ourselves what we could teach our children, Nicole and Rafael, about our cultural heritage. Instead of giving them names and dates to memorize right here in our adopted home, we thought that we could visit places that are important places in Philippine American history. That evening, we were able to name 30 places. Now, what do we mean by a place? So let me give an example. This is a place. This is the Philippine Chancery Annex, 1617 Massachusetts. It was acquired in 1941 and was intended to be the office of the Resident Commissioner of the Philippines. Who was the Resident Commissioner of the Philippines? That was a non-voting member of US Congress from the Philippines. Think about how mind-boggling that was. A Filipino citizen was a member of US Congress. Non-voting, but a member nonetheless. And this was their office. Now, the Pacific War started in December 41, and then a few months later, May 1942, members of the Philippine Commonwealth Cabinet were evacuated and ended up here in Washington as exiles, and later worked in this building. I can pretty much spend an entire afternoon just talking about this building because so many extraordinary people worked here. Diplomats, nation builders, soldiers worked in this building. Some of the first Philippine migrants in DC worked in this building. There was this one person who worked here. He trained the first generation of theater directors in the Philippines. But he was also an economics professor at AU. There is this one person, Jose Garcia Villa, one of the most important poets of the post-war period. He worked here. And so did Benvenido Santos. Rita mentioned Ben Santos, who won the 1981 American Book Award. He worked here as well. One more person who worked here, Carlos Bulosan, was here in late 1943, exactly at the time when he had an ascendant literary career. He was becoming known as the chronicler of the Filipino-American immigrant experience. Okay, one more story about this place. That's Carlos Romulo. He was a fascinating figure. He was a journalist, editor of a major newspaper, university professor, Pulitzer Prize winner, wartime general, one of the signatories of the UN Charter, a global leader. He was the president of the UN General Assembly. He was present at key moments of world history that shaped much of the world we know today. But one morning in August 1945, he was here, 1670 Massachusetts. He appeared there. He lowered the Philippine flag and put the blue stripe on top. Now, for context, during wartime, it's the red stripe that's on top. So that morning, he inverted that flag, put the blue stripe on top, thus marking the end of a global war. Now, fast forward to 2023, we found 30 places then. My database now has about 269 places. And we've been taking people on walking tours. That's my older child, Nicole, taking people on a walking tour. Maybe someday we could do an independence movement joint tour. Sojin, this is 14th and K. Yours is 14th and H. And then here's a map that we designed, DIY walking tour together with the Philippine Embassy. And then finally, this book. Over the last 3 years, I put together this book, organized by neighborhood, each neighborhood identifying a place, and each place accompanied by a vignette. So thank you so much for sharing, for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Erwin. I've always been very intrigued by Bataan Street and Corregidor Street, as how streets are named here in DC. I would like to invite up Malia and Yahya Luqman, who will be talking about the American Fazl Mosque. Hi, Yahya.
Thanks. Thank you. My wife Maria is not here at the moment. She'll probably just walk through. She had to bring my son from a soccer game. So my name is Yahya Luqman. I am the Imam of the American Fazl Mosque, which is 2141 Leroy Place in Panorama. This is the first permanent mosque in Washington, D.C. There have been Muslims in America since as far back as Columbus. Even here in DC, there are very historical stories of Muslims in Georgetown, Yaro Mavud, whose portrait hangs in the Georgetown Library, going back to the time of the building of Washington, D.C. itself. So Muslims have been around in Washington, D.C. for a long time. But there has been no permanent place of worship. Muslims would worship in their homes. They would worship in rented places. It was not until 1950 that the foreign minister of Pakistan, the first foreign minister of Pakistan, on his visit here in the United States, that finding that there were no mosques, he bought this property, which in itself is historic, and I'll get into that in a moment, to be used as a mosque. And so since 1950, this building has been used as a mosque. There have been many famous scholars who have served as the imams here. And now, currently, I am the present imam. So with regards to how this fits into Asian American Pacific Islander history is, and my son actually, when we came in, he was sitting back there, my younger son, he was like, Abu meaning dad, this is, everyone is Korean and Chinese here. And well, growing up, actually, the first, I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I was 4 years old when I migrated with my family from Pakistan. But growing up here in America, there's no box in your, school forms or your citizen or your census forms for Indian Pakistanis, right? It's Asian American Pacific Islander. So that's what I've always identified it with. Although I didn't understand the Pacific Islander part until I got married to my wife, whose family is from Indonesia, and she's walking in just as I suspected she would. So again, that's how in America we all identify as Asian Americans, and as such, this place has served as that beginning place for a lot of Muslims that come from throughout the world, not just India, Pakistan, but throughout the world, including Pacific Islands and different parts of Asia, as well as Africa. This building is historic in that before it became a mosque, it was actually the home of the widow of C.V. Riley, who is known as the father of modern entomology. He was one of the first scientists with the Department of Agriculture and the first curator of insects at the Smithsonian. So Smithsonian people are here, I know they can look it up. So he died in a freak accident, a bicycle accident. And so his widow built this building for herself and for her children in 1913. She passed away in 1948, and her heirs then sold it to, as I mentioned, the first foreign minister of Pakistan, who bought it with his own private funds to be used as a mosque. He belonged to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. The Ahmadiyya Muslim community itself has been in the United States since 1920. And there's a connection with that arrival of our community to the United States. There's a flyer or brochure actually on the back table, and in it, there's a picture of this gentleman here. who was the first imam of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community to the US. And when he arrived in 1920 in Philadelphia, he was actually detained for a month and a half, almost 2 months, because of the Exclusion Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, going back to 1882. And surprisingly, the ship was coming from England. And on board, there were a number of Chinese. You usually expect the Chinese to come from the Pacific, but they were coming from England. And when he got off the ship, there's a picture of him, February 15, 1920. He is dressed in a Chinese coat as well. So it was, again, it was January, it was very cold. So there was probably a Chinese passenger that lent him that coat. So he was detained and then later released once his case was cleared. And he established the Ahmadiyya Muslim community here in the United States back in 1920. Like I mentioned, it was not until 1950 that this building was purchased to be used as a mosque. It also then, from 1950 to 1994, served as the national headquarters of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. So this gentleman right here is the first foreign minister of Pakistan. His name is Sir Muhammad Zafrullah Khan. Again, he's another personality that a whole hour to our lecture can be given about, just as can be given about this individual and his connection with the Asian American community. So this is him in the building itself. His name is Sir Muhammad Zafrullah Khan. He's also mentioned in the brochure. He's also a very famous diplomat, world-renowned diplomat. After he was a foreign minister, he became the first Muslim to be the president of the UN General Assembly and then the president of the International Court of Justice. It was under his presidency that the apartheid laws of South Africa were abolished on an international level from the International Court of Justice. After World War II, while he was still a foreign minister, it was because of his services to again, World War II, India, Pakistan were all one country. They were part of the British Dominion. And although being the victors, he made sure that Japan, Germany, that the citizens of Japan and Germany were given full rights and they had an opportunity to excel and succeed. And so he was very well regarded in those countries as well. In the 50s and 60s, when the Arab countries were becoming independent, he again worked for their independence and is well regarded in those countries. So this building, 2141 Legore Place, which became known as the Fazl Mosque, Fazl meaning the House of Grace, it was frequented by diplomats and by people of all circles from different parts of the world because of that connection. The Islamic Center that's on Massachusetts Avenue was built almost a decade later, in 1957. Also, the Muhammad Mosque here in this nearby here is from 1960. So again, until other mosques began to be built, this served as that gathering place, a place of worship and communion, as well as diplomacy for people of many nations. Yes, so being the national headquarters of our community, there is a picture from the 70s. Again, very multiracial community, Asians, African Americans. That these are the members of the national board from the 1970s. And again, there's a meeting going on within the building itself. This building, the mosque actually hosted many other events, lectures. This is a lecture by the first Muslim Nobel laureate in physics. His name is Dr. Abdul Salam, pictured here, standing next to a very famous imam and scholar of our community who is still alive. I think he's in his 90s now. And again, you can see the audience is a mix of children in the back as well. But you know, scholars and people of all races. Again, our community outgrew the mosque long time ago, and just here within the DMV area, we have 4 other mosques that we have built. Around the United States, we have built, we have 55 mosques. So again, it's it's a historic building, but a lot of the pioneers that started out here They have gone to the suburbs or other states and have gone on to build larger and greater communities. But we're still proud of the fact that we have this building that we use as a mosque. So thank you. If you have any questions, oh, one other thing that I forgot. So there is still a connection with different nationality and different languages. Our mosque probably has the largest collection of Islamic literature, scriptures in different languages. I brought along with me the Holy Quran in the Korean language. And again, these are welcome to take it in the Chinese language and the Japanese language. And I know we have many other languages, over 70 languages. Another connection is that one of my predecessors, Imam at this mosque, is now the chief Imam in Manila as well. And I know there's a Filipino community there as well. So there's, again, a very international connection with this mosque. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Yahya. We actually met Yahya the same day I met Rita, was at the mayor's office. And it was interesting, Malia, hi Malia, and her sons kept coming back to the family, right? And so we thought, they keep hovering around us, you know? We thought it was the candy, but it was actually that Malia was like, my husband really is interested in Asian American history. And so that forged our conversation, and Yahya and Malia invited Sojin and I graciously to the mosque to visit. And it's a beautiful mosque. And, I invite others to, if you're interested in checking out a tour, to talk to Yahya and Malia as they are in the back here. But thank you also, Yahya, for the great segue on Pacific Islanders. Next, I want to bring up Keani Lee, who will be talking about the Kingdom of Hawaii in DC.
Hi. Nika aloha mai. I'm Keani, and I'll be talking about the presence and visibility of the Kingdom of Hawaii in DC. Some pictures. Okay, first, I wanted to talk about how there is a presence of Hawaii in Washington, D.C. The Kingdom of Hawaii was formally recognized as its own country, because it was, throughout the 1800s. And by 1893, the Hawaiian Kingdom maintained over 90 legations and consulates throughout the world. In the U.S., the Hawaiian Kingdom had a legation in Washington, D.C., and it served the same function as an embassy would today. And before the year 1898, pretty important year, representatives of the Kingdom and then Republic of Hawaii could be found in Boyd's directory of the District of Columbia, which I'm assuming is like the yellow pages of the good old days. Right here is pictures of the directory. And next, I wanted to talk about King David Kalakaua. He was reportedly the first sitting monarch to come to the United States, and he was here because he traveled from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. on the brand new Transcontinental Railroad in 1874. And in that same year, when he was in Washington, he was invited to the first state dinner by President Ulysses S. Grant. So this is a portrait of David Kalakaua that was at the White House in 1874 when he was here. And there's a portrait of King Kalakaua visiting Ulysses S. Grant. And there they are bowing to each other. Okay, this is a pretty short presentation, but lastly, I wanted to talk about Queen Liliuokalani. So shortly after King David died, she visited DC about 2 decades later. So what brought her here was she was here to protest the annexation or the U.S.'s plans to annex Hawaii. And while she was here, she stayed at the Shoreham Hotel and the Cairo Hotel, which are both in Northwest DC. And there's a picture of her protest right there. So yeah, while she was here, she was able to meet with lots of people and prove her diplomatic skills. She was very smart and strategic. Even though her plans didn't necessarily work, remembering these things and their presence here in Washington, D.C. is important to think about how we talk about the statehood of Hawaii as we currently talk about in U.S. history today. So, mahalo nyo. Thank you.
For those who are interested in more information, this is on Instagram. So, and lastly, I want to introduce my student who I've referenced several times, Emma Lucier-Keller. She just graduated the University of Maryland, and she has her master's in historic preservation. She joined me 2 years ago. We were awkwardly introduced, like, you're Asian and you're Asian, you should get together. We were like, it's weird, right? Like, don't do that. And, you know, despite the awkward Asian association, I said, do you want to do Asian American history? And so we started to talk about what are some potential ways I can mentor her. And one of the things that we brought forth was we actually were invited by Grace, coordinated the team to meet at the Korean Legation building. So you're going to hear a little bit more about the Korean Legation building from a historic preservation side. And it was something that was really interesting that Rita, when I met Rita, she said to me, we have a social history. We don't have the technician to write the nomination, right? And that's what's often missing. I mean, it's weird, I'm a professor, but I can't write the architectural description. But Emma's going to go through her process of writing the architectural description for the Korean Legation building. So, Emma?
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Emma. Thank you, Dr. Magalong, for that introduction. And so, yes, this presentation is going to go into the process for writing a National Register nomination for this case, the Old Korean Legation building. And you sort of got an introductory into its current affairs and some recent history on the Legation building. And I'm just going to double back a little farther and give you some more in-depth history as well. But first, let me explain what a National Register of Historic Places is. It was established by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and it's basically just a giant inventory of historic properties that reside in the United States. And individuals like myself can nominate properties we believe that are historically significant to this registry through this registration form pictured here. And so now I'm going to go a little more to the process in relation to the Old Korean Legation building. So through this form, I recommended the property be significant at the national level, given its association with early U.S.-Korean international relations. And then the National Register form tries to sort of catalog its properties under certain criteria. So you have criterion A, B, C, and D. And they each have a different meaning. So A means associated with an important event. B means associated with an important person. C means the property has architectural value. And D means the property or site has the potential to offer future historic data. And that's usually associated with like an archaeological site. For the property here list, for the Old Korean Legation building, the property is applicable under criterion A, given its important association with U.S.-Korean international relations. And in the areas of significance, obviously ethnic heritage, Asian, and more specifically Korean, and its role in politics/government. The period of significance is 1889 to 1905, when the legation or the building primarily served the operations for the legation. And so this slide here now just goes really briefly into some of the steps and processes for the National Register form. There's two main bodies of writing that you have to do for the National Register form. There's an architecture section and there's an historic significance section. And they're exactly as they sound. The architecture section, you provide an architectural description of your property, its interior and exterior condition. And then for the historic significance section, you have to justify why you believe this property is historically significant. And so it's kind of like a research paper. You explain the historic context or the events that are going on around this property and how that property played a role in those events. And then within the other sections of the National Register form, there's sort of what I call general identifiers that you have to fill out. And that just means like name, location, current function, which we know is a museum. You need a verbal boundary as well as some additional visual documentation like a USGS map and interior and exterior photos. And obviously, given the time limit, I can't go quite into detail in the history of the Korean legation, but just know, obviously, it's very in-depth, very nuanced, and I'm just going to give you a few key facts and events just given the time limit. So first off, in this top photo, you can see Seth Leather Phelps. He was the original owner of the Old Korean Legation, but what was then serving as a residence for him and his wife. He bought the plot of land along Logan Circle, but what was then Iowa Circle in 1873. And in 1877, he decided to build a property there. And that was his residence. And then by 1889, it served as the legation. It served, sorry, my words. So from 1877, he built a home. But by 1889, it was rented by the Korean legation to serve as their headquarters and residence. And that served as their home and residence from 1889 to 1905. But, right, how did we get from point A to point B? Sort of backtracking again, I'm throwing a lot of dates on you, but in the mid-1800s, around 1866 to 1881, U.S. was becoming very much interested in the Kingdom of Korea at the time, but not much success because Korea wasn't interested in any U.S. political agreement or relationship with them. But in 1881, the Kingdom of Korea was becoming much more interested in a political agreement or a political relationship with the United States because they were experiencing increasing pressure from their neighboring countries, Imperial Japan, China, and Russia. And so having the political arm of the US to pull on in case of any foreseeable conflict was very advantageous. And so by 1882, US and Korea signed a treaty called the Treaty of Peace, Amity, Commerce, and Navigation. And its original motivation was to protect future shipwrecked mariners that got stuck along the shores of Korea. But it had a really important article attached to this treaty, which was the diplomatic article. And this diplomatic article allowed each country to house one another's diplomatic representatives, allowing for the Korean legation to be formed. So that was signed in 1882, and it's the treaty right there. And by 1887, the first permanent Korean legation was established. And by 1888, they made it to DC. And by 1889, they made it to what is now the Old Korean Legation, where they would reside there until 1905. Okay, so that's a really rapid fire history lesson, which you are all now experts in. The next section goes into the architecture. And this is sort of just to give you an idea of like all the terminology needed to write the architectural description. The structure is a Second Empire style, and it features a central wing, two-story bay windows, exterior and chimneys. It has an Eastlake influence, an aesthetic, part of the aesthetic movement design in it, which you can see in the brackets and in the porte-cochere. And in a little more detail, I'll show you here. So this is just some snapshots of the different elevations and features that you would be mentioning in the architectural description if you were writing it. And then really briefly, because I'm running out of time now, just some interior photos, which you can get all through the Old Korean Legation website, which is really excellent. I really encourage you to go look at it. They have a virtual reality option, so you can go through and have a virtual tour. And that's where all these pictures are from, so thank you. But it's a central hall plan. And so these are some of the interior shots of the front parlor, back parlor, what was now serves as the orientation room, but was a servant's quarters and butler's pantry, the dining room, and the central hallway. I just really like the floor design, sorry. Pocket doors, which is a really unique feature. Again, my camera was just not wide enough to get the floor to ceiling pocket door that slides in and out of the wall. This is the second story. So you can see there's a library, bedroom for the minister, and then offices for the legation staff. On the third floor is an exhibition hall, which is currently serving the function as a museum. So thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Emma. That's just a taste of what it requires. I think her final paper on the nomination for this, how many pages up? 200?
Yeah.
On average. So if you're looking for someone to write a nomination, Emma is a good person you can talk to. I don't know what her employment status is, but next up it's time for Q&A. We didn't take questions or provide for time for discussion until the end. And so I want to bring up one of our advisors, Tony Sarmiento. Tony was actually a great person. When we pivoted, he pivoted with us. We pivoted on Zoom, and we asked Tony to talk about what did it mean to grow up Asian American when that was a new term in the 1960s. It hadn't been invented yet. It hadn't been invented yet, right? And as researchers, I often tell my students, when you're going in the archives, you're not looking up Asian American, you're looking up what? Oriental, right? You're looking up terms that you're not allowed to say anymore. But it was a moment of like, how do you start to imagine growing up in the 60s and 70s here in Washington, D.C., growing up as a professional? And so I want to introduce Tony as our MC for this Q&A. So if you have any questions to any of our speakers today, I give you the floor.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. So, I got up in D.C. My father retired from the U.S. Army in 1914. President biggest factor in his plan all along was that my mother said we did, but my mother said we shouldn't go to stay here for the children. So we ended up, we bought a house off this military in Nebraska Avenue in 1958. There were no Filipino Americans in the neighborhood. Ironically, Sojin grew up 2 blocks away, but came much later. And it was very different growing up in DC as one of the few Filipino Americans. But I think today has been just a wonderful program. I just want to make sure everyone knows, if you want to learn more, there's a wonderful news report that's come out by the Pew Research Center that studies Asian Pacific Islanders, Asian Americans, whatever term we want to use. It's a superb report. And one of the findings that I thought was really intriguing, and I think our program, an entire day today, sort of reverberates when we look at this. Despite our diverse origin, we report shared experiences in the United States. So it's so much diversity we've heard in just this afternoon. And we also feel connected to other Asians in the United States. So 60% of these Asian Pacific Americans, people of Asian origin, would describe themselves as Asian if they passed them on the street. But also they think that what happens to the United States, what happens to Asians in the US affects their own life. So this is powerful new information. And as much as we try to generalize about our group, it's nearly impossible to think about the shared experience. Let's talk about food. I was curious about why there was no lumpia here, but I got it. So why don't we just take some questions or comments? Yes, please. Well, don't be shy now. Now, who's learned something new today? So again, based on this Pew Research study of Asian Pacific Islanders, 7,000, really made sure that so we'll confirm this was a valid study. The 7,000, this nationally representative sample, only 24% said that they felt familiar enough about Asian Americans. 24%. So in some respects, it's shocking, but another way, it's not that. And I think programs like what we heard today and the ongoing efforts of all the individuals who you heard today, we're going to have new knowledge that will be made available. And we hope that if any of you have family archives, if you're an old person like me, I turned 72 this year, history is in our heads and history is often in our closets. Don't throw it away. Give it to the archives. Please, comments, questions? Yes.
I'm older than you.
You want to come up here so we can have it on? You want to introduce yourself?
My name is Grace Ng. I was born in Washington, D.C. My parents knew Reverend C.C. Hong, who had the Chinese church on 1011 L Street. Next door was the USO Club. It's now the Morrison Clark Hotel. I think it's still there. I've been not doing it so long. But I grew up in the Petworth area. I did not live down in Chinatown like a lot of young Asians of the first generation. I went to Petworth Elementary School, which is now the DC Police Communication Center on Shepherd Street. I went to McFarland Junior High, and I went to Roosevelt High School. There was a bookkeeping teacher there, Miss Odom, who was very nice. She had me work in the school bank, and she told me I had to teach bookkeeping to myself. So I took a class in that. I mean, I taught myself bookkeeping in the banking. And she got me a scholarship to Benjamin Franklin University. It was wonderful. I had a great career being first as a clerk typist bookkeeper, then an auditor, and then I went to the DC government because I met somebody I used to ride the bus with. She said, you better think about going to the government because one of these days your boss is going to retire and you'll be 50 years old trying to find a job. So I took her advice and I went to work for the DC government, thinking that one of these days I'm over to the federal government, but it didn't happen. There were opportunities in the DC government. I became an auditor, then a conferee, and then a tax appeals officer before I retired. So it was a great career for me and a wonderful life living in the Petworth area during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. After that, things changed, you know, the drugs and prostitution and everything else that comes along with it. But now it's gentrified, so it's much better now. Thank you.
Okay, great. I understand the family for wrestling.
Oh, yes. My parents, well, actually, my father and his father, I think, started Saiwu Restaurant on Upshur Street, 8th and Upshur. And my mother was the waitress. And that time, she made all the clothes for my sisters and myself because we were poor at the time. And so my mother would go down to Woolworths and buy the cotton material, and then she'd make the patterns herself. And those days, I guess, you know, people were creative. She used to teach me how to embroider to keep me out of trouble, I think. But now I do a lot of embroidery work because I joined a senior center and we made quilts by hand. They do more of the Underground Railroad type patterns, but we have a quilting show once a year at the senior center up on Kennedy Street. It's the Hattie Holmes Senior Wellness Center. Thank you. What year? I think it was in 1938, sometime around there, before my older sister was born.
What was the name?
Saiwu, S-I-W-O. It's now a grocery store.
I live up there.
Oh, Sylvia Hunt's, the little south of Petworth. Yes.
Around 14 minutes. then also 150 blocks west. I'd love to go and see that building.
Now that laundry, Lee's Laundry. I may have gone by. It's not
The one in Tacoma Park.
No, the one down on Columbia Road.
Columbia Road.
I used to walk to Woolworths there to buy, was it bearer scarves in those days? They were embroidered bearer scarves. And I remember going past the laundry.
Right. So when did you start working for the DC government?
1974.
So I also worked for the DC government. I worked for the mayor's youth office in 1972. And I think it's a whole other story, that project that needs to be done. What kinds of opportunities did essentially a majority Black government give to Asian Americans? Whether it was you or me, Jack Lee, who worked for the mayor's youth office, and I think Harry Chow would have talked about how Mayor Washington's administration invested in many programs in Chinatown long before it was fashionable, long before there was this thing called CEI. And so my growing up was learning about how to navigate in a majority African American government. And there were so few non-African Americans, it ended up just being a wonderful learning experience. Because we were invisible in some respects, but we were just part of the team. And I think that you need graduate student signs of this. Next comment, question. Yes. Come on up so we'll get you.
Hi, my name is Evelyn, and I just got graduated from the UMBC history program with a bachelor's degree. I'm interested in learning how are you guys going to preserve or kind of keep all of the research in place so that people who want to learn more about it get back to it. So you have somebody make a little book plan or any like storage like that makes sense.
Great question. So who can answer this one?
So our final report is sorry. Is like it'll be online. But so we're supposed to submit it to the National Park Service in September. And the intention is you submit it to the National Park Service and it gets included. Like the city of Los Angeles, the state of California, and the state of Boston, and Maryland is on their way. So what happens is the document gets part of the National Park Service, and then I had mentioned that both Korean Legation Building and Owens Building both have individual structure nomination forms. Those two will then get passed on, and they will be considered by our State Historic Preservation Office here in DC, and then that will be included on the National Register. So all of that, to which I theoretically see with DC Preservation League, it'll be a PDF online. Just like the purple or the pink book, you can find that online on National Park Service. You just Google NPS API from the study, that will come up as PDFs. So you'll be able to find it. And that way, it's something that where, like the city of LA, when we submitted that, there was a Korean American contact statement we wrote for the city of LA. When Hamsadam came on, when the developer bought the house, we swooped in and put in a nomination right away. That nomination put a stay on the demolition. And because it put a stay on the demolition, then the developer got mad at us because they couldn't do anything. It was a loss of profit for them. So they sold it to the Korean government because they were willing to purchase it. So anytime something is identified in our study, and if, like, let's say the DC government wants to potentially demolish 500 I Street, our document is the guiding document that says you cannot demolish this building. So that is what it's a protective measure, to say that scholars are thoroughly researched it and you can't touch it. So that way, this is our way to say to the DC government, don't touch Chinatown or the places that we've identified. These are important to us. You need to consult with us and make sure that it's not something you just easily sell off to a developer and make it to, you know, those mega colossal apartments. So,
Thank you. I think we might have time for one more question.
that was it.
Sure. Before I hand it over to Ted, another place for documents on the Rita is created archives at the University of Magalong Park, which is a terrific resource. Maybe Ted, you could have others.
Pete and I, we haven't seen each other for so long.
Without the mask. You know, maybe you were in the same meetings.
Thank this question. So I recently joined this nation in the competitions on this big national level and all that, and we're giving lots of money. And it's like, what do the little people do? What does the communities do? So what we did, so at the at University of Maryland, we have the Filipino American Community Art. And that truly is a community effort. So for example, you know, over time, you know, once I was putting together these projects, interviewing you know, people just kept starting to give me pictures of their parents' had. The big, you know, souvenir portraits and stuff. And I thought, you know, what if there's a fire in my house? What if there's a flood over in New Zealand, which is an island? So that's when I worked with the University of Maryland to say, you know, first they sort of looked at me like, you know, why would we want to take this stuff? But, you know, after I told them, I kind of had to come to Jesus meeting and said, look, I've been doing this for 30 years. I'm a professional archivist in archives, and I had to give them the big story. And so after like 3 hours of this, they said, okay, let's do it. Let's do it. We've got really cool stuff here, the historic stuff, very significant. We were able to time and significant parts of history. But the point is that it's a community effort. So it's you know, all the local people in the Washington area who had Filipino stories and things like that. So go on a tour. You know, maybe let's set up a tour for people who are interested. Come and look at the University of Maryland. You know, it's a small collection. It's probably about 900 linear feet, which probably will stuff with you guys. It's several shelves of materials in the library, but have a tour, see how it's organized, and you can see how, you know, you can start to collect materials from your
Getting a little bit late, so I sort of want to begin to wind things down. So I thank so much all we've done Tony here to help wrap things up, and all of you here. But I want to thank all of you again, each of you, contributing and supporting our programs. I do want to say this, that it is not just a single study that's going to be stored in some city, or it's going to be placed somewhere. It is a combination, as Rita says, and I wanted to say that too, there is a community of archiving abilities, right? One of the things that Sojin and I started off so many years ago was figuring out where, once we get our stories, granted, we uncover, we find our stories, we record them. And the most important thing for us at that time was we uncover the story. And we tell them also in our own voices. So the concept of talk story is actually a more profound thing than just a bad verb. But the thing is, it's an old Hawaii concept. And if you have been around as long as I have in some of this stuff, it was the beginning of the Asian American literature movement and the Asian American studies movement. And that concept was that we have our stories. Each of you all have stories, right? And you need to tell the stories, and you need to tell the stories in your own voices. Because if you don't, somebody else will tell you that story. And that takes something away from you who can't understand. So we need to find our stories first. We need to store them. Then the question is, where do you store them? Because we asked at one time we were coming here, well, all these guys in DC Chinatown are sharing stories and they're fantastic. Where do we place them? Is the Oral History Project in DC? It was at the Washingtonian Collection. It was at the JMU, whatever program and so forth like that. Library of Congress or the APEX program. All those make sense, and we should look at how we store and keep these stories in those places. So don't think that you can do one report, hide it, and put it in the city, and that's going to prevent a developer from developing a place or taking that story away from you. We have to be vigilant about constantly telling our own stories, right? And I would say that we go further in our talk story program. Dan, who I don't know if he's still here, but he is such a faithful person. Like I say, we used to say almost 10 years ago, nobody would listen to us tell stories, not yet, but gradually people came and we said, we don't care. We're going to tell the story to ourselves and we're going to record it and we're going to do it regularly. We're going to do it regularly and we do it regularly in a certain place. I just had a conversation with somebody at the Chinatown Festival, which is across the street. He says, Ted, 12 years ago, you said you weren't going to take the storytelling outside of Chinatown. I was going to focus in Chinatown. But the purpose is you come together, we come together and you share your stories. You remember your stories, you share your stories, and then you tell your stories together. That is the community. That is what makes beyond buildings or anything. See, the buildings, as Richard and I keep saying, the buildings could talk. The most important thing is the stories that they can tell us about that place, right? Whether that place is now a bank, when it was once a restaurant, or once, or any of that sort of thing. So the gentrification is our issues, and that's what we have to deal with. How does urban development go forth? And, how does that happen? How do we preserve the ability to tell those stories? But it is the telling of the stories that important. Jan just did a wonderful series of conferences with the ASLA, National Building Museum, all about Chinatowns, and not on the single topic of the gentrification of Chinatowns, but how do you create Chinatowns? How do you store the stories again? So that's one of the things I want to leave with you. One of the great values of the places of this Talk Stories series is the ability for us to have time to get together and just talk to each other. Tell your stories, because sometimes you're shy and you want to just talk to each other. But when you talk to each other, you have those stories. And that's the thing that we want to prove here. We are going to have a number of other programs. Usually I just say, thank you for coming, but we have a series of other programs coming. As I said, Jen just finished a series of wonderful stories about urban Chinatowns, and we call it Urban Chinatowns in Plain Sight, urban development, questions of that sort. How do you design buildings? How do you lay out the streets? That's all on the streaming right now on the website. So take 1882 Foundation YouTube page. Take a look at it. It's got some good stuff, and I want to thank Gabby and Mia and everyone else who is in so give him a hand. About urban Chinatown in plain sight. We are now developing a conference that will be about rural Chinatowns and varied sites. SIG versus SIGHT. Anyway, that will probably occur in June 2024, probably Utah. It's a follow-up on some of the programs that we're doing at the Heritage Tours up at the Summit Tunnel in Lake Powell. Our hope is that that tunnel is going to be, it'll be nominated, and it's part of that nomination process, which was explained. Going to be nominated. It's going to be selected based on archaeological consideration. So that is moving forward, and we're hoping that that will be done before the end of the year. If that happens, that is the type of monuments we want to preserve. And that monument is so large and so beautiful, so wonderful and so significant that that establishes our place in the American history. So that is important. The other thing is, we hope that can be done before the end of this year. What is happening also at this year is the 80th anniversary of the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. That would be December 17th. And what we are trying to do is to have a reception over at the Asian Reading Room at the Library of Congress, in which you guys all mark that day, December 17th, and we'll be celebrating there for the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. We'll have some lectures about the historical, legislative history of the Exclusion Act and the repeal. We also hope, I don't think I am violating anything by letting you know that our hope is that we get the president to issue a statement of apology, and we hope that that occurs at that date. If it doesn't, we're still going to celebrate and it's still significant. Also, this year is the 125th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision on Wong Kim Ark. Wong Kim Ark established birthright, a fundamental principle of immigration law and who can become Americans. That's another thing which all of us should start figuring out. How do we celebrate? How do we emphasize those things so that people can remember the significance of those, of what happened in those processes and so forth. Next week, June 11th, we're going to have a talk story on Sunday, and that's going to be with Veronica Lee. And that talk story will be about how you write memoirs. So you got a story to tell. You don't want to tell us orally. You might want to start writing your book. And so Veronica will be talking about how you do that. And we'll also have somebody from the Library of Congress who will talk about Asian resources in the Library of Congress. And that will be the week after that, we're actually having another talk story. And that's Foundation, the U.S. Attorney's Office of the DC government. So that one is going to bring in Ed DePorn, the director of the Angel Island Immigration Station Facility, and another director from the Ellis Island Immigration Facility. They will have a conversation and discussion about the history and the differences between those two immigration processing centers. I think that's going to be a great conversation. So there's lots of things happening, and we're still waiting for your story. Just let us know when you're ready to tell it, and we'll set it up.